Makes sense.
Um, so I know one of the points we wanted to touch on was very simply, why do businesses need a disaster recovery solution or a plan? I mean, I know that as a result of COVID-19, there's what seems like a ever increasing amount of cyber attacks, and also it's difficult because you're not on prem all the time to check and make sure things are operating well there. So can you speak a little bit to that point? Why should a business pursue a disaster recovery plan? What are the basic benefits there?
Well, from my point of view, and Chris may have another one, and that's good. I'm looking at it just from a general business standpoint. And I apologize, I don't have the exact figure, and I can get it for you, but I believe it's something like 93% of businesses that are hit by something, some sort of catastrophic problem that takes down the systems that run their business. Fire, tornado, doesn't matter what it is. It could be ransomware. If they're down for 7 to 10 days, they have to declare bankruptcy. It doesn't mean they went out of business. It just means they had to go through a reorganization. To me, the best analogy, if you will, that I come up with is having backup. And that's what a lot of these folks think, hey, I got backup. So I'm good. I'm protected. I've got backup. What they don't have is a plan to take that backup and turn it into running applications that their folks can use. And that's kind of, to me, it's like a tantamount to, I've got a spare tire in my car, but there's no jack and I have no lug wrench. Can you get the tire changed? Yeah, but it's going to take an awful lot of effort, flagging down another drive. You get the concept, right? It's a long, tedious process versus having a disaster recovery solution whereby hopefully, you have a button to push, if you will, something automated that will bring those systems back up relatively quickly. And then you have different ways to access that data to start running your business again, and then worry about fixing whatever happened in your data center. So I know I kind of went around a big circle there, but it's important because if you don't have the solution, you will be in trouble. It's not if, it's just if you have the problem. So that's my two cents on it.
Yeah, and I hear the conversation, but we haven't had a fire in 50 years, and we haven't done this, and we haven't had that. So I think there's also something to be said as far as natural disaster or facility disaster, something like that, like a true disaster. When people think of disaster recovery, they're thinking of from a physical aspect, something being destroyed or taken away or theft or something like that. How often, or I don't know if there are actual statistics around it, how often do you hear of disasters being caused by their own users? Because I've heard the terminology or the phrase, sometimes your biggest vulnerabilities are your own users. From a security standpoint, I know that can be very true. What about a disaster recovery standpoint?
Most situations where there's a ransomware attack, most situations, it's because somebody internally clicked on something. People that have been trained, it just happens. Somebody gets the wrong email at the wrong time, and they're not thinking 100% straight because they got 6 other things on their mind, and we're redoing our Outlook, and I need to go log in through this other portal, right? And then they go give away the access, and then something happens. That's kind of out of your control. You can put your business in a mountainside, right? And you can't stop that problem from happening.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, there's no, you can't just move out of a floodplain or have the best fire suppressor system that's going to stop. Like if you have employees, if you have a team of people working for you, then you have inherently built in your own vulnerabilities. And then on top of that, once you do have a disaster, because this is the other side of it, and we do disaster recovery planning, so we do the full documentation, the roadmap, the thinking process, putting that together in a documentation or a manual. So that way, when you do get yourself in a situation, like, are we full down? Are we partial down? Is it one server? Is it all servers? Is it only some data and not others? Is it our data at rest and not active? All those things, where's our CRM? Where's our ERP? So we walk through all those different scenarios and help build out a plan for each one. and we'd
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, this is what you do, step 1, step 2, step 3, should this thing happen. But I mean, having employees is also part of the reason that you need one, so they can be
Right.
you know, you don't want, I love hearing success stories and businesses that are growing. And so it's like all of that growth means good things for, you know, business owners. It means good things for the economy and our communities and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, okay, you have to have a disaster recovery plan that you may need to evoke because of your team, but then also to keep your team up and running, because if you have 20 people that are sitting stagnant, that could be tens of thousands of dollars, you know, of lost business. And so the faster that you can get things up and running, you can minimize your loss, from a standpoint, and then you can also get them back to working and you know, remediating the losses that you did have.
You
I think
know,
there's also different types of data that you would want to protect, as you were talking about, right? So Infrascale has the 3 different solutions: one that handles the disaster recovery for the servers, one that handles backing up those endpoints, and then one that handles backing up cloud data. With everyone with the coronavirus working remotely and bringing their own devices, you even have one more point of control that you've lost, right? You don't know what's running on these machines that they've got. They might let their kid play some fun clicky game on it at times, and they might get ransomware that then spreads to their documents or spreads out. So definitely right now, with everything being remote, there's even more entry points for things to get into corrupting the data or compromising it.
and on top of, the COVID is such a great example for a couple of reasons. One is, okay, it's a virus. What are we talking about? Ransomware. It's a virus. Nobody thinks they're going to get it. Nobody thinks they have it, right? Until they have it and they've gotten it, right? But there's the argument about people wearing masks and not wearing masks, right? But the fact of the matter is, people do get it, and it's the individual that's going to cause it, not necessarily maliciously, right? And so you're playing, you're gambling with your corporate brand, with your corporate money, that you're going to be safe. So you're going to run around without any protection, and nothing bad's going to happen to you. That's not a good gamble for you to take with corporate money, right? The other interesting thing we found is when COVID first hit, a lot of folks were having to work remotely, and a lot of businesses weren't set up to work remotely. And we had folks calling us saying, hey, can we fail over to the data center? Yes, go ahead, because we have a ton of bandwidth in our data center. So it was a short-term resolution for folks. So in other words, like, what's the disaster? They didn't really have a disaster. I mean, what they did was they tried to have their 100 employees work from home, and the bandwidth, the pipe coming into the building, wasn't set up for all those employees accessing that way. It was set up to access on the LAN internal to the building, right? So even what we define as a disaster nowadays, and that goes in hand with if you have a railroad track relatively close to you, and there's some chemicals on there that and it spills, right? Your building could be just fine, but the police aren't letting you into your building because it's quarantined off because there's some poisonous gas in the air. So there's way too many potentials, and then the downside of, if you do happen to be unlucky enough to get it, is huge. Declaring bankruptcy is not a simple thing, even if you get through it. And the other end of it, 96% of, I think this was from Gartner, 96% of folks who had a disaster recovery plan were able to survive a ransomware attack last year. So that's the opposite. That's why you should have it. There's negatives and there's positive. That's the positive reason why you should have some sort of a plan, not just backup, but that plan, like you guys talked about, to recover from, through the backups, to recover from the disaster.
Well, as you're talking about disaster recovery plans, I mean, they're only as good as you're testing them as well. So I think as an important component when you're creating that plan, it's important to have role playing and kind of scenario-based testing. So what if we get a virus? Let's simulate that, and how do we recover? And then, kind of sit down and review your lessons learned and enhance that plan so that it's continually being adjusted for your needs.
One of the big reasons people don't do just what you described is because there's inherently a lot of time involved. Um, and so the solution that you're looking for, you want to have something that's automated, uh, that you can just test also with the push of a button, and you can do it whenever you want. You're not restricted as to when you can do it. You don't have to call anybody. You can just set it up on your own. I'm going to do this test. We're going to push this button. These systems are going to come up. And then, as you mentioned, there's more to the plan than that, right? Where do people, we need people to test log into it, to make sure that we can access the data. Someone needs to do some testing against the database. Let's make, so the server's up, right? But is the application actually working, right? Those are some things that once it's up that you would have as part of that plan to go ahead and do. But if it's too complicated to just bring up the servers, that's when it just doesn't happen, because it involves too much time. People got to do it on their weekend or at night. And it can get expensive too. It costs overtime and other expenses, maybe with your vendor, while you're doing testing. So you want a solution, hopefully, for that plan that eliminates as much manual tasks, and also any cost that would be involved in performing those tasks. So
yeah, I think there's a couple of different levels of that testing as well, because we've done testing, on a quarterly basis, for clients that, have like I don't know, I'm just thinking like regulatory need for it. And, we would just go through the steps. Okay, let's spin this up and make sure that the server comes on. Okay. And then you hit go and the server comes up, and then they say, let's make sure that we can see the data. Okay. Yep. All the partitions and all the data are there. What we were not taking into consideration, and this again was part of the discussion, but not part of the action, because it was deemed unnecessary, was, okay, we can see the data administratively, so we're bringing up the server, we're restoring some systems, we're even getting the networking going between the core infrastructure, but how do your users get to that data? Because, if they're local and they have workstations that have all the applications installed, and only the data points, the data structure is on the servers, but there's no interface for it. There's no, application that's been already installed or connected. How does that happen?
sure.
And then even then, beyond that, some application vendors and software vendors require a registration process with the application that is installed for licensing purposes. So can you even install and register again without purchasing additional licenses? So we've had to get through some of the disaster recovery planning and documentation and the manuals and everything that we built. We actually run through those. So we turn off every bit of their internal production infrastructure, including workstations. We don't test from a workstation that's still up and running, because we're playing true fire drill. We're saying, okay, your servers are gone, your workstations are gone, you guys are now working from home. And if part of the plan is that, we're going over to George's house and we're going to work out of his basement, okay, well, let's select those machines now so that we can put this into a true scenario. We go through the actual, literally and physically walking through it. Okay, go over to George's house then. Make sure his bandwidth is sufficient, the upload and download speed, all the workstations that you're using. If it's everyone's personal workstations, is one of them missing a driver for for a camera or a mic? Do they even have cameras and mics? Things like that you kind of take for granted. It's like, yeah, okay, we can restore our servers, everything has been verified, but can we even get to it to use it? Is the other piece of that we've flushed out, and some of those. That's where you kind of have to be careful. It is up to the business and their culture to weigh out.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. That's that disaster recovery plan. It's more than just your data coming back up, as you mentioned. It's hey, how do I get to it? So do I have VPNs already installed, that access where that data is located, and they're in the tray on all the machines that are part of disaster recovery plan A, right? Because there's different kind of disasters. Did I lose a server? Did I lose the entire data center? Is the building gone? Depending on what the disaster is, you're going to have different, just like with our military, right? You've got DEFCON 1 and DEFCON 5 and a few in between. And so it's the same thing. What's the level? And based on Your plan is where do I go when it's disaster recovery plan A, or when it's B? Do I go home? Am I supposed to report to the church because we've reserved this church that's 30 miles out of town because we don't want to be in town because everybody and their brother's going to be using the cell, and so we won't get a cell tower. We think we're going to be fine just going to the Kroger parking lot, right? But everybody went to the Kroger parking lot in town. We went 30 miles out of town where we're not going to have the same cell issue. The tower there isn't going to be, have hundreds of thousands of people trying to access it. There are so many things to take into consideration. And at the end of the day, the way you work through all those problems, because there are some that you can just enumerate, right? We need to check for this, 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 and this. But then each company individually, just like each individual is different, right? And so there's some that you just can't enumerate ahead of time, or you don't know the details of until you do what? Test it. And that's where the testing, as we kind of talked about, it's developing the plan, testing the plan, fixing the plan, and then testing it again and fixing the plan, right? Until you've got it to where it works. And we've done it in this scenario, and this scenario. And for most people, maybe it's just, we're going to treat even the smallest of disasters like a full disaster. We're going to fail over to the cloud. And this is how, you don't have to have multiple plans. You can have one plan that covers everything, right? But you should at least have that one plan, and you should have tested it, and not just once. You should test it a lot at the beginning, right? Get it to where you've tweaked it and it works. And then on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or quarterly, whatever you feel comfortable with, right? Make sure it still works, because configurations have a way of drifting, right? And something could change in your environment that causes part of that recovery not to work 6 months from now or a year from now. So you should constantly test it.
That's a good point, because, from a testing perspective, we've had clients, where the DR plan was created, developed, tested, and then something in the infrastructure changed. Like we encrypted the data because of compliance, or we enabled the multi-factor authentication. And that component never made it to the DR plan. So we went to the next stage of testing. It was, how do we get our data? It's encrypted. Administratively, like Doug said earlier, you can see it, but how do the users get to it? So it's constantly, like you said, testing and then updating the plan to incorporate all of your latest changes, whether it's infrastructure wide or, I now need internet access in order to allow or achieve MFA, so that authentication can be granted. So those are components that are often overlooked. The DR plan is set in place, but our environment is not exactly stale. It's constantly evolving. So we got to continually update that.
It helps to have a disaster recovery solution too. That, I mean, if you can get all your employee base, or at least a good sample set, a test bed of those employees to just walk through it, it helps to minimize, when you're talking the cost of doing all this testing and everything. If using the software and recovering the data and putting it in place so that you can test against it, the accessibility, the data structure, making sure that it's not encrypted in a way that you can't get to it. If that's just a couple of clicks away, and then you can focus on the more physical aspect of it. Okay, now you go here, here's the game plan. It's already up in the background. Like just sit there and click buttons and see if you can get to it. At that point, it becomes like poke at it and let's make sure that we can get it.
Sure. Yeah. Again, I think what you hear here from our conversation, right, is that it's the constant testing. And again, constant doesn't mean every day. It's just some kind of regular basis. And the simpler it is to do the testing, in other words, the less cost there is for me, whether that's in man hours or actual, cash, the simpler it is, the more often I can do it, and the easier it is to do. So, you can do testing, one weekend and maybe half of the employees are testing, or a quarter of the employees are making sure they can access. Not everybody has to do it all, because how hard it is to get everybody. Someone's going to be on vacation. Someone's going to have a personal emergency. So, there's all sorts of reasons why you're not going to have everybody all at once. So the simpler it is to do the testing, you can do, testing more often, but not everybody has to be involved in it. But certainly, yeah, the ability to do the testing, it's a lot more than just saying, yeah, we're backing up our data, and yeah, the next step is, of course, having that disaster recovery plan. But if you're not testing it, then it's like a football team that doesn't practice. To use an analogy,
Well,
right?
yeah, I've been in that hot seat before, where well, what's going on? Why can't we spin things up? And I'm like, I've gotten all the notifications. They all show that they're successful. I can even go back through the logs and show you that it verified that your backup was successful. And this was, I mean, I won't say more recent, but I would say within the past 5 to 7 years, where you got all the green lights that said that things were working, and then when you went to restore it, it's like, well, this and well that, and compatibility this, and a driver here and there. So it's important, because even when the green lights are shining, there are those unknown things that you want to make sure that you work through, even if it's once a year or once every 6 months.
Right.
It's not like you have to do it every other weekend. I mean, just
Right.
something to have proof of concept, like, okay, have we ever tested this, period? Well, no. Okay, well then there could be variables in there, and that's what I was gonna ask that a few minutes ago. Is along with the security layers and everything that go on top of all this stuff, when you get into the the encryption and all those other layers that the security needs to undo if you're going to be restoring it, are there, I guess, putting us in a little bit of a vulnerable situation or conversation, like, are there any known compatibility issues as far as like applications that we're aware of, or anything that when they are backed up and then restored, that they don't restore well? Because I think we've run into a few like database driven backend systems, locally installed, that like something, either because the data was like still in motion when it was being backed up or something, where when you go to restore, it's like, well, you need that application to do its own backups and then restore from that, in addition to the infrastructure backup.
I want Chris to kind of answer this, because it's kind of more in his wheelhouse.
So yeah, there's always going to be something out there like that. There's always going to be that exception, but we have tools built in that can help with that. So we have the ability to run pre and post processes. So if we do have one of those homegrown or applications that needs to do a data dump and then we sweep it, we can set that up so we run that data dump, back it up, and then clear it off. We've got other things where the way that we do the imaging, using the tools, and we take an image of that server, in most case scenarios, you can boot that server up and then use the native tools to actually do the database recovery. So an example of that would be, we have SQL APIs built into the agent, so we can actually interact with SQL and have it give us the data dump. But I don't typically configure that. I just back up the whole SQL server and then boot it up on top of our DR appliance, and then use SQL's native tools to export whatever tables or data sets or databases that I need out, and then import that back into the production server. Because the native tools that are built in there are definitely going to be better for manipulating that data. So we've got a couple different options out there, and we do have some best practice guides on docs.infrascale.com on how to protect different things, like a lot of people are using Intuit or stuff like that. We have ways that we can back that type of data up, but we do have native integration for SQL and for Exchange. So if those are particular ones that you're concerned about, we do have API integration with those. And for the rest, there's a lot of things that we've done to be able to back them up and be able to recover them, and make sure that we're getting consistent copies of the data.
Yeah, I've seen that be particularly frustrating, where you go to backup, or things are backing up, and then you restore and the data restores, so you have it, it's flat, it's at rest, you're not actually logging in and interfacing with it. But yet another reason to not only test, but just check that compatibility. Like, okay, the data is there, but then once you start using it, like we've restored in at least one or two instances, restored in applications, back at database in the engine and whatnot, and it was fine. I mean, you could even connect to it, but then we found that there was, missing bits and pieces, or when the system went down, it went down pretty hard, and kind of it corrupted a little bit of the data, so it's, making sure that you work through those things. But again, you don't know if you don't know. So, I mean, at least run through it the first time, the one time
And what's great
to
about
verify.
having the DR appliances, you can go in there and you can right click and you can boot up any of those point in times for any of those machines, even multiple ones that interact with each other on top of the appliance. And we have the option to not put it on the production network. We could put it on an isolated private network. That way those machines can talk to each other. They're not going to affect anything in production. And you can make sure that the whole application comes up and the different pieces can connect and everything's working the way you would expect it to be. You could even throw, back up a workstation and boot up a workstation on that isolated private network to connect to the application. So it gives you a lot of ability to be able to do testing more frequently, faster, easier. Being able to boot up any machine from any point in time. Well, we say any point in time, any of the backups within minutes. It just gives you that flexibility to be able to do a lot more frequent testing.
And you touch on a good point too about the consistency of the data. And the backup, you can back up any data you want. Doesn't mean it's not corrupt data, right? And so the ability for your solution to also have be able to test that backup and make sure that that backup worked, doing it in the background. You're not even involved in it. It just does it in the background. When that particular backup completes, I want that backup to boot in the background and show me the boot screen and check for a driver so that we know that you can actually access the server, because you can back up garbage, right? So that's an integral part of being able to recover when you need to recover. But then also, again, through testing is the key word. I think we just keep repeating here. We might discover with that particular application that there are issues if we try to do it this way, but through testing we figured out, well, if we do it this way it works. And so now you've kind of created, that's part of your disaster recovery plan, because that's your specific application, and that's what helps us with the best practices specifically toward that particular end user.
But yeah, and there's no two infrastructures alike, even
Right.
if it is your own being restored from a backup. It's still not alike because you're restoring data that once was.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get as close as you can. So, all right. So, I mean, hitting on kind of the hot topics that at least I encounter on a regular basis are, well, how do we access our data? When do we test it? How do we know what to do when something happens? So that's your disaster recovery plan and all that. The one piece that is also overlooked, and not until because you're the hero. You come in and everything is down or gone, depending on the way that you look at it, and you put your hat on and spin up the DR. We follow through the documentation, we get everyone working, and then the lights come back on. Okay, now what? Like how do we? What's the fail back process? What's the process for moving the production changes that now, one, you've recovered the downtime, so the data or whatever that you missed while you were actually down and while the recovery process was happening, and then you're back up and running, you're back in production, you have your people up, say you're running on it for, I don't know, a week, 3 to 5 business days, we'll say is a scenario that we can use here. And then the lights come back on and we say, okay, now we need to get back into the production system. Everything came back on, or we acquired new hardware and it's ready to go. What does that fail back process look like? I guess for sake of conversation here, the power got cut. They were doing construction at the entrance. So your building is still intact. Your server and your equipment is still intact. It still houses all the data as it was when it powered off. What's the failback process?
That's one of my favorite.
Yeah.
I was gonna say that's one of my favorite features, because that's one of the parts a lot of people don't look at, is being able to do the failback. So we've made it a simple 3-click process to get that data from the cloud back to on-prem. So if we're talking about a scenario where we didn't lose our appliance, we still have all that data on there, but we don't have the latest versions that we're running in the cloud. So what we'd actually do is promote the cloud one to be the primary, demote the on-prem one to be the secondary. Then it's going to sync back just the changes that have happened while it was running in the cloud. So when I do this and I do a push back to primary, typically it takes, on a machine that I've had booted for like a day, it'll take 2 or 3 minutes for a smaller machine to push its data back on-prem. Even though it's, you know, a 10 gigabyte machine, it can push that data back really quick because it's only got to push those changes. So step one, we shut down the one in the cloud so we know that it's not getting new transactions. We push that data back on-prem. So it's a really easy process to go from the cloud back to on-prem. And it's actually something we do typically when we do any of our demos is we'll show setting up an appliance with some clients, backing them up, turning on replication, booting in the cloud, setting up orchestration, and then replicating everything back on-prem and doing something with that data once we get it back to that local appliance. And we can do all that pretty comfortably in a 30-minute demo session.
And while you're doing that fail back process and you're replicating the data back to production, is the production system still up? Not the production system, but are the users still able to access the data in that recovered console?
They're not. We've got to bring it down to be able to move it. So during that time, you would take an outage, but you would do that outage, you know, off peak hours, the hour where it's going to affect the least amount of people.
Sure.
Yeah, the beauty of failing
something
back.
To add into the something to add into the disaster recovery plan, that there is downtime required during that fail back process. But fortunately, as long as you're recovered, you've bought yourself that time.
Right.
Yeah. So it's kind of like DVRing your disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. You get to plan your recovery. You don't get to plan your disaster. Right. The disaster happens when it happens, and you're being reactive. The good thing about the recovery is I can plan that when it makes sense. You don't have to recover at the moment you're ready to recover. You can wait till midnight or the weekend or whatever makes sense. So
that's a good way to put that. Who's owed credit for that quote? you can plan your recovery, not your disaster.
I just made that up. So
you're famous now.
I guess so.
Awesome. So the platforms that you do back up, premise, full like standalone infrastructure, Microsoft hypervisor, VMware, vSphere, hosted, what do you do and what don't you do?
So we cover pretty much anything VMware out there, any of the Microsoft OSs, most of the Linux OSs. We do have agents for a lot of the different flavors of Unix that are out there. It's not really our specialty. You know, we're really good with the Microsoft OSs and applications and the VMware stuff. That does include Hyper-V. We can go to the Infrascale cloud, which is kind of the default option, where you would get one appliance and then it would replicate up to Infrascale's cloud, where it has a partnered up appliance. And that way you can boot things locally and boot stuff in the cloud. We'll provide the VPNs and all that. And we don't charge a premium on that. Like, we don't charge extra for the amount of data that's stored in the cloud or for the VPNs or running in the cloud or testing or any of that. With that being said, we do have some customers where they want to fail over to their other location. So we can sell you both appliances and you can be your own DR site. Now with that, it's a little bit more heavy work on their side because we don't control their network, so we can't control that cloud side. So we can work with them to make sure they set all that stuff up correctly, but they're going to be responsible for all the stuff that's inside their own data centers. And then the last option we've got is we can go to public clouds. So if you wanted to replicate up to AWS or Azure or something like that, we can do that. However, typically, cost-wise, it's not the most affordable option to go with. Not necessarily because of us, just because they do charge you for ingress, egress, CPU, storage, you know, all those different components for running in the public cloud. But if it's something where you've already got a good infrastructure there, or something that you've got a good partnership and you want to use, we do support it.
Okay. So what other, I guess, the purpose of this the new type of virtual meetup that we're doing, and I know everyone is probably at this point very familiar with virtual, you know, webinars and virtual meetups and whatnot. So traditionally, what we would do is a 3-part series. You know, we do it quarterly. So the first month is a meetup where, again, traditionally we were in person. We would meet up at a local restaurant or coffee house or winery or something like that, whatever the group wants to go do. and have a very informal kind of community discussion. Like, what are you guys doing? What's working? What's not working? You know, tell me about your life. You know, that what is happening in relation to the topic that we've picked for that quarterly initiative. And then the second month is a webinar to where we get into more of the nuts and bolts. It is more of a presentation, but with Q&A. So there's some interactivity in that form. But we truly we can dive down. We can do like a demo, like you guys were saying, a 30 to 45 minute, you know, okay, look, we've backed up these servers. This is how you recover. This is all the connection points and the networking behind it. This is how we fail back, and run through all that stuff in a demo, and then have Q&A. Well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And then the third and final is a lunch and learn, and that's where we actually get together again, but we have a little bit more hands-on, to where the vendor will come out with us, and we'll host lunch. We'll host, you know, if we're at a winery or cigar shop or something, and we'll host, and we'll provide some stuff. But the vendor comes out, and we talk about what you want to talk about, but we also have, you know, like we can do it presentation style, we can do it demo style, we can try and break some things, and it's more so hands-on, more so interactive, because it's at that point you know, it's the people that are, it's going to be the audience that's truly interested in it at that point. So you can ask questions, you can have us, you know, hey, push that button instead of you know, push the red one instead of the green one, and let's see what that does. You know, you have it your way. And it's kind of like a trial, like get your hands on it, and that sort of thing. So today, in today's climate, we've adjusted to that, and we've made this virtual meetup, which is a meetup and kind of it's a talking webinar, but also with a lot of interactivity. So any other questions, any other scenarios that we haven't covered, or any other pain points or things that you've heard, or anything like that about disaster recovery solutions in general, that we can answer for you?
Well, one thing I'll bring up, you know, I've been doing this for a little over 20 years, specializing in disaster recovery. So literally started out when, you know, we had modems. So any kind of cloud backup or over-the-wire backup just wasn't a valid option, all the way to now where I don't know a lot of companies that aren't required to, that are backing up the tapes and shipping those off-site. Everyone's digitally pushing their data off-site. And then, as we had talked about earlier, with the 3 different types of data that we protect, we might not even have all that data in-house. So we might have some of it in the cloud. We might have some of it at different locations, some of it sitting out on all these endpoints. Well, with every company I've worked with before, that required multiple solutions, which with Infrascale, we have 3 different solutions for that. But all of them are managed under the same dashboard, from the same place, with the same reporting. So it's really easy to have these complex, we're using some SaaS, we've got some, you know, public cloud, we've got some on-site, we've got these remote desktops and laptops and iPhones and iPads. It's really easy to manage collecting all of that data and making sure that those backups are working. I did about a year in tech support for Backup Exec way back in the day. And I can't tell you how many times we had people call in and they had their backups misconfigured, where maybe they were overwriting their backup every time a new backup ran. So at the end of the day, you just had your last backup of that last server. Well, other backups were successful, but they couldn't actually restore anything other than that last server. And it wasn't until they needed to do a restore they realized what they had done. So I really like that it's all in one interface. It's easy for you to report on and make sure that the solution is configured and doing what you expect it to. So when you do have that disaster, you get hit with that ransomware, you're not like, oh, we weren't really backing up Eric's laptop for the past 6 months. So I really like having it all in that one dashboard. I think that's a really powerful part of the solution, even though it's not necessarily like, oh, we support these 5 checkboxes, but being able to manage it nice and easy, deploy it, you know, using industry standard tools to get it rolled out, you know, all that kind of stuff to make sure that it doesn't end up becoming shelfware. If we've been in IT long enough, we definitely know of shelfware where it was so complicated to deploy, we just left it on the shelf and we never used it even though we bought it. We definitely, as Infrascale, we don't want to be that. We want to make sure that you're actually using the solution.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's a good point for sure. I got another question offline here. What's the scalability, and how do you plan for a business that's growing?
You dropped out a little bit there. I heard scalability in businesses that are growing.
Yeah. So yeah, how do you spec that out or scope that? Because we get that a lot of times, and a question that just came through was, in a scenario where it's a business that you grow by so many hundreds of gigs per year, whatever that number may be. How do you calculate what size, like how do you size it appropriately, and then what do you do if you outgrow it in the meantime, when you're actually using it, and what does that
So there's kind of
upgrade
two
look
different
like?
answers to that. With anything that is a cloud-based solution, so cloud to cloud, cloud application backup, direct to cloud backup, anything where it's like that, that is a consumption-based model. So it would be a pay-as-you-go type style. So you would be, you can always grow that amount of data that you have because it's reliant on our storage on the back end. Now, when we look at the IDR or the disaster recovery appliances, because they are an appliance and that's a physical thing, then what we do is we have you do a sizing document when we start, looking at your environment. How big is it? How much data do you have? How frequently is it growing? How long do you want to keep your backups? How frequently do you want to back up? All the things that consume up storage. What types of backups are there? How much do you need to boot that's critically, locally, and in the cloud? And then we size out the right appliance for you based off that information. And 90% of the time, I'd say even 95% of the time, the default appliance specs are perfectly great for most workloads. Now, occasionally we run into someone where I got a terabyte of data, but I need 256 gigs of RAM to boot it. Well, that's outside the normal scope. So there'd be a slight uptick on just adding in that more memory to that box to be able to cover that workload, but it's definitely something we can do. And even if you grow outside of it, one of my customers has 1,600 VMs. Well, with 1,600 VMs, they've got multiple backup appliances, and we spread that workload across multiple appliances to be able to get them all backed up in an appropriate amount of time. So we can definitely scale out all the different solutions. The only one that we really need to plan on storage is going to be the appliance, because again, we're going to ship you a physical piece of hardware. Now, we do plan it out so that it should be good for 3 years in your environment. So say I have a 2 terabyte current need, and I got industry standard growth patterns, then we're going to make sure you have at least a 6 terabyte unit. That way we know that we can handle all those backups and your growth over the next 3 years. Now, if you do outgrow the box, we will provide you with a larger box. And the only price that goes up there would be, how many terabytes you're protecting. We wouldn't necessarily charge you for the larger box.
Yeah, just to expound upon that, take, for example, the customer who maybe merges with another company, and they've got one of our 6 terabyte appliances. They started out with 2 terabytes of actual data. Of course, we used compression and deduplication on the appliance, but with the growth rate and other such things, again, we put in that 6 terabyte physical appliance for that 2 terabyte license, if you will. Now, let's just say, I don't know, a year and a half later, they merge with another company, and all of a sudden their capacity doubled, and they want to use the same solution. The other company maybe didn't have a great solution that they were using, so they're going to expand that solution. Well, we would we'd go through that sizing process again, and let's see exactly what we should have, right? Let's make sure we've got the right appliance, and we'll ship in that appliance. And we'll help you, offload the data onto the new appliance. We'll take care of all that. And the only cost difference to you would be the fact that you now went from 2 terabytes to, say, 4 terabytes of license versus actual, capacity. But the data we're backing up went from 2 terabytes to 4 terabytes, basically. So there's no upgrade fee per se, other than the more backup that you're doing. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. And so as far as managing all this is single pane of glass, not one pane of glass for the physical appliance, and then one for cloud, and one for anything else that you're doing. It's all in the same console.
Correct. You're going to the same console, even if you have multiple appliances. again, you're managing it all from one dashboard, one console, however you want to refer to it.
Okay. And then how do the users, so that, say there's one network administrator, and then there's an operations person and an accounting person, like, can they all have their own accounts to get into there, and what do the permissions look like?
Yep. So we can do role-based administration. So you can configure and say, all right, I'm going to create a role called help desk, and help desk can see all the logs and do all the reporting, but they can't go in and manage anything. And I can create a role for admins for maybe the SQL servers, and I let them do something special. So we do have the ability to break out different roles, and there's a series of, I want to say it's 70 to 100 different roles that you can check off that you want to assign to each user. So depending on what you want them to have access to be able to do and what you don't. Now you also would have the ability, because not only is this got the ability to scale out for a company, and they could have multiple companies or locations, but we do have a partner level to the dashboard where a partner could actually help manage a customer's environment if that customer wanted that. So you've got the ability to either be a managed or unmanaged asset to the partner, where, again, what's great about that is if you were having a disaster and you needed to reach out, you could reach out to your partner, your MSP or someone, and have them be able to help turn all that on and help get things up and running.
I think that's, so far, I think that answered all the questions that I had and then I saw coming through. So, all good. Okay, well, hopefully that helped answer some questions and maybe open some eyes in terms of, what the what kind of solution is available, and then also, the preparedness, that not knowing what you don't know, kind of a thing. So, what questions should you be asking? Did you know that you should be testing even though you're getting, successful alerts? And then the fail back process. I think a lot of those things are kind of the unknowns that you don't really think about it until you're in the thick of it. And at that point, it's not that it's too late. It's just, it adds extra stress and extra effort that you don't really want to be thinking about. I'd say you got your hands full already, trying to restore your data, restore your systems, and getting your employees back to work than, having to worry about, the rest of the details that should have, well, as Eric said, you can plan the recovery. You can't plan the disaster. So when you got a disaster on your hands, you're trying to fight fire. And then as much as possible that you could have planned out, it would be nice to have all that stuff done. That way you're not dealing with it in the meantime. So, well, good. Well, I hope that was helpful to everybody involved. And obviously we will be redistributing the recording of our conversation today for anyone that couldn't make it. So if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we can pick up on next month's meeting, which is going to be a webinar, a little bit more of a presentation, and we could take it from there. So Cooper, any last minute announcements or messages for the meetings?
Not really. I thought today was a great conversation. We'll expand upon it next month. Just be on the lookout for another webinar we have next month with VMware as well, and then we're exploring some other conversations for the second part of the year. So thank you, Chris and Eric, for being here and for providing all of that information. It was very helpful. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Take care, everyone.